we as cycling fans and as non-pros know very little about what it's like inside the women's pro peloton.
Yeah.
And I think that, we really focus on helping people get faster with this podcast, and we're going to tie in a lot of this, but the context of it I think is really important. Like when you're talking about like pro, like fast, you don't have to share any names, of course, but like top level women in that field, what are they at in terms of like watt per kilogram, like the top performers? You may have to guess, but
yeah, I mean, I don't know specifics on certain people or anything like that. I do know that from working with my coach, who's worked with a lot of top level women, that some coaches out there, for example, in a time trial, will look at trying to get, if they're coaching somebody for a world championship, they're trying to get as close to 5 watts per kilogram as possible in the TT. And I think there are a lot of limitations with that, just physiologically, not just in terms of physiologic capacity, VO2 max and things like that, but also just like body size. Like I'm really tall. It's really hard for me to get lighter than somebody who's maybe 5'2". And although I might have some more mechanical advantage as far as being able to put out power, there are huge variations in that. So I think it's not necessary to get to that point. And I do know a lot of women who, have medaled at world championships, for example, who were not at that watts per kilogram. There's a lot of other factors that go into that. Obviously, you guys have talked about aerodynamics. And then in the mass start races, skill and tactics play such a huge role that I think it's fair to say that in the women's peloton, at least, there's a massive range of, for example, FTPs.
Yeah.
And the nice thing about that is because the skill and the tactics make such a difference, there are opportunities for virtually anyone once you get to a certain level.
How tall are you?
5'10".
Yeah, so is that tall in the pro peloton?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, right?
Oh, yeah. There have been many a time when my luggage has been lost and I've had to borrow clothes from my teammates. It's not good.
I can see that, especially racing in places like Italy or something else like that, where people are tiny little people, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So when you talk about, let's go back to watt kg really quick. So a lot of the time we're talking about power to weight ratios, and we always, and it seems like we always talk to them somewhere around 4 to 5 watts per kilogram. But for a pro women athlete, could she be below 4 watts per kilogram and be competitive? Or is there any sort of like floor to that, do you think, roughly? Of course it varies, but
I would think there is probably a floor. I don't know what it is. And I think that you can actually get away a lot with skill. So especially in some of the European races, the roads are super narrow and they're really, really technical. And being able to position yourself well or manage cobblestones or corner well in the rain, those are the things that will put you in a position to make selections that, even somebody who's stronger than you would have an easier time making the selection. If they can't physically be in the position to do that, you're out of luck. So I think, I don't know what the floor would be, but I think there's a lot of variability there.
So I want to talk a little bit about getting started on, so we recently talked about getting, this question inspired a whole lot of follow-up questions on, I think you listened to it too, but it was us talking about how to get started in cycling and what we felt were like the least, or I should say the most friendly, most inviting, or best environments to learn in terms of the different genres of cycling.
Yeah.
So really talking about like friendliness, accessibility, that sort of thing. So I want to know your thoughts on it because you went from swimming, but you were familiar with competition because of that. And then you came over into cycling in the college realm, basically, but then you've also raced in the pro realm. So I'm sure that you've spoken to plenty of other athletes. Where do you feel is the best spot to start, and is it different perhaps for men and women?
I don't think it's that different, honestly. And one thing I want to say just off the bat is I think crits are actually the best way to learn the race. I really think that they're awesome.
Strong case for that.
They can be intimidating, but they provide this little microcosm of bike racing tactics, and it all happens really fast in a short amount of time. You can do, crits pretty often because they're not too taxing, and you can really learn a lot from them. So I think they're great.
You're basically sessioning a single portion of a course. The courses are so short.
Yeah.
In mountain biking, it's called sessioning usually. Like if you just repeat a certain section because you're working on it, that's the cool thing. It almost kind of gets rid of the variable of the course because you know it so well. So then you can focus on everything else.
Pivotal and selective moments of a race.
Yeah.
All happen within a criterium.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
And you're learning cornering, you're learning, group riding etiquette.
Yeah.
I mean, all of those things. So if you are just getting started in the sport, I would say find a group ride. And one of the things that I really wanted to hammer home is being competitive doesn't mean being unfriendly.
And
and this
that's
is
a good point.
a really huge thing that I think a lot of women struggle with. And I struggled with it almost the whole time I was a swimmer, and it took me like well into my cycling career before I wrapped my head around it. And what I realized is in swimming, in any sport, when you're out training by yourself, there's only so hard that you can push yourself.
Yeah.
But when you've got somebody next to you, whether in the next lane or they're next to you on the group ride, you find levels that you didn't know you had.
Especially when you're new, I
Right.
feel like,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So actually, that person next to you is doing you a massive favor, right? Like they're the one that's providing the impetus for you to find, a whole new level of depth that, you might not have known you had. So in that sense, your competitors are actually your allies.
Yeah.
And when you show up to a race, you are doing the same for them.
Mm-hmm.
And I know so many women and young girls, and I don't know if I think it's a lot different for guys. I think, there's a lot of negative social feedback for women to be competitive because it's like, a guy's competitive is like, oh, he's so ambitious and that's so great. And then a woman's competitive and it's like, she's really mean and she's not a nice person.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah.
So
Total double standard. Yeah.
right. And I think that affects women pretty deeply. I know it did me. And I hear from a lot of, especially young kids, like, but I don't want to beat my friends. I don't want to make them feel bad. And I think that's a total misunderstanding of what competition is. It's not about making someone else feel bad, because if you're out and you're competing against somebody, if they beat you, it's not that you don't necessarily have to feel bad. You might be disappointed, but the truth is you learn from that. The fact that they beat you just taught you something critical about what you need to know to become a better athlete.
Yeah.
I've learned a lot.
Versa.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, as bike racers, so many people start the race. The odds are so low that you'll actually win. I feel like you have to understand that, because otherwise, you come from like the game of soccer, right? Where it's like 50-50 if you win, or like T-ball, right? When you're a kid in the United States, and it's 50-50 if you're going to win or not, maybe not 50-50, but there's two players, right? Yeah. And then in a bike race, there's so many people that you're going against. And then also with a bike race, certain people just simply will never win at a certain type of race, right? Yeah. While others will have an advantage. So if you don't find a way to learn from that experience, and if you don't put the halt on trying to take everything as such a painful loss, it's really discouraging. Yeah, I think Pete Moore said it on our YouTube channel, right? Like other measures of success, but there's that side of things where, especially as a bike racer, you should look at any time you go out and race, it's an opportunity to learn, and that's the main goal. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it does change things for sure.
And I think this is something you guys had talked about in getting into sport, that gravel races were maybe a good place to start. And I think that that's a really interesting observation. And one of the things that I've seen happening is, especially lately, everybody's been saying road is dead, and everybody's doing gravel and cyclocross, and that's great. But I think road is getting an unnecessarily bad rap here. Agreed. And I think part of it is a lack of willingness to be vulnerable. And so when you go into a race, it's not that it's super fun to win, don't get me wrong. Right. But you don't, learn a lot from that necessarily. I mean, you are going to learn, but you always learn more from when you don't win the race. Totally. So looking at your competitors as allies, understanding that, showing up to the line and not holding back, even if you're racing against a really good friend, you're actually doing them a really great favor, because you're helping them learn more about themselves as athletes. But in the gravel events and the cyclocross events, when you're watching the race, you have no idea who's in what place, because everybody's all over the course and the gaps are huge and who knows what's going on. And so there's no sense of being in front of an audience and failing in front of an audience. Whereas if you're in a crit and you get dropped, it is painfully obvious.
You're off the front.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Can I add to that? That's a really good. So that's a very good point. I feel like road is actually just becoming the poster child for traditional competition, perhaps, and what people view. And gravel, in many respects, is the antithesis to traditional competition, in the sense that it's just like, go out and ride. Yeah. But every single one of you that's ridden a gravel race, all of us here, we know that it is just as competitive. When you're out there, and you even see guys that are just like floating around back there, they're totally racing with their friends, everything else. But the strange thing is, I feel like, we've kind of like typecasted road into this role where it's only this lose or entirely fail. And when you fail, there's no gain from it.
Right.
But that's not the case.
Right.
And it doesn't have to be that way at all.
We were just talking about different types of riders yesterday here internally, and Pete and I were explaining it to some non-cyclists. We say there's one set of riders who will only race if they're at peak fitness, and they won't do any other races. And I saw in triathlon a lot of times where people will DNF. I think you see this too in other races. If they start to have a bad race or they got too hard, rather than getting a bad result, they DNF.
Yes.
Because that bad result is somehow tied to their self-worth.
Yes.
Totally.
Yes.
And then there's the type of people, like Pete's like this, he'll just race. He loves racing, races all the time. And then to your point, he learns so much and becomes such a better racer. So he has a better shot of having great results when he is super fit.
Yes.
But it's okay to get last place. And two, I think Pete recently, he did his job in some crit, and then I think he got second to last.
Yeah.
But he did, his normal power was like 410 for like an hour. So
Oh,
obviously like super fit,
Yeah.
but he didn't care what place he got because he did his job for his
Right.
team. And it's not about the result in the pack.
And if anything, that's a cool part about road racing.
Yeah.
And I think that like I really do like kind of racing alone when there are teams. It's fun, because you can kind of like be a maverick and float around and leverage off of other groups. But racing with a team is incredibly fun.
Oh my God, it's the best.
And it helps you learn so much. And it makes it changes the entire experience of racing, and it's really helpful for people.
Yeah.
I mean, you talked about like having a support network, and hopefully, you aren't changing teams every year, so then your support network changes. But if you can have that sort of thing, then road racing entirely changes. You're seeing your friends there.
Yes.
You're all uplifting each other, and then on top of that, you can change things. Since you're not pro, that's the fun thing. Make the sprinter be the climber one day on a race and see how it works. Like you can change things up and. Yeah, it totally changes it. Road is getting an unfortunate and undeserved bad rap, for sure.
And I think part of it, I mean, honestly, I think social media feeds into this a little bit because social media sends this message of outcome over process because you're comparing your own behind the scenes to everybody else's highlight reel. Like, nobody's nobody's taking pictures of their terrible days. And I mean, we joke about this all the time, but it sends a really insidious message especially about sport, that like, what's the point of doing a race if I don't win and I don't have a picture of me posting up to put on Instagram?
Yeah.
Like there's a lot of reasons to do that.
Yeah.
I was at a race, it was a local race in New Jersey a couple years ago. And I was in a break, we got off the front, we lapped the field, Well, there's a gal I think who ended up in no man's land, and afterwards she was coming up and asking me and a couple of the other girls that were in the break about, well, what are the rules in that? How does it work? And she walked away, and one of the other girls just rolled her eyes and said, "Oh, she knows better." And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" She goes, "She's been racing for 5 years, but she wants the Evelyn Stevens story." And I was like, "What? I don't understand." She said, "Well, Evelyn Stevens, like overnight phenom, blah, blah, blah. The fact that Evelyn came out of that, that area, everybody wants the Evelyn Stevens story, which means that everybody feels like in order to make it, you have to be this overnight phenom. So nobody wants to even admit to how long they've been racing, how long they've been trying. They want to project an image of
I just picked it up. I was
being
good
a
at
rookie.
it.
Yeah, I just
Right,
started, blah, blah, blah. And it's doing yourself such a disservice. I mean, and unfortunately, I think most of what we see as being overnight phenoms aren't actually. I mean, most of those people, even if they're coming into a new sport, like for me, I picked up cycling pretty quickly, but I had 12 years of developing a massive aerobic engine as a swimmer. Yeah. So it wasn't like, and we used to do spinning as dryland training at Stanford. So it wasn't like I was coming out of nowhere and just picked up a bike and just, but somebody on the outside looking in might see that.
And I'm sure you had a lot of hard days over Europe.
So many hard days.
Yeah, exactly.
So many hard days. But I think this is a really important point. Don't be afraid to be vulnerable. Don't be afraid to show up to the crit and totally get dropped. No one is judging you.
Yeah,
literally
totally.
everyone there has had a bad day, and you can learn so much from that. And know that your competitors are your allies. Like, even if you are racing each other and not showing any mercy in the race, it doesn't mean that you can't go to them afterwards for a hug or reassurance or advice or whatever that may be. And if you're somebody who's just getting started in the sport and you show up to a road event and everybody looks really serious, I can tell you, I have a really serious resting face.
Yeah. That's a good way to call it. Yeah.
It might be off-putting. That doesn't mean that if you came up to me and said hi and asked me questions, I wouldn't have all the time in the world.
Yeah.
Honestly.
A sweet analogy for that, I think, is in general fitness, people are afraid to go to the gym because, one, they think they don't look like everyone else, or two, this happens with guys, that they feel like they're not going to lift enough compared to everyone else. So somehow they have to lift before that. But like,
That's a great point, actually. Yeah.
no one. So with cycling, when new people come out, I think cyclists are all happy that new person is out.
Yeah.
And at the gym, if there's someone who's just, for guys, there's this huge guy, everyone's like, they don't care how much weight you're lifting. They're like,
Totally.
good on you, bro, for being here and working out.
Yeah.
And then if you go ask that experienced person for tips, like, unless they're in the
They'll
middle of a
love it.
set, like
Usually very
in the
forthcoming.
middle of squats, don't ask them.
Yeah.
But generally they're like, hey, bro, like, could you help me? Like, I'm saying bro because that's the gym stuff.
Yeah.
Usually, in general, they're like amazingly helpful.
Approachable and just an awesome information resource and
Yes.
happy to share what they've learned.
Yeah.
There's another topic I want to talk about that doesn't get discussed very often at all. I think Stacey Sims is one of the only people that I've heard of talk about it, is women's menstrual cycle and how
Yes.
that affects training.
It's huge.
Can you talk about that?
Yeah. So this is something that's really important for, all female athletes. And, I just want to say to anybody out there, this is something that you really need to think about, be aware of, and, be able and willing to communicate this to your coach, because it's a huge part of our physiology. And so, during a monthly cycle, there's kind of, 2 weeks of high hormone and then a week of low hormone, and everybody gets affected differently by this. And, going back to, you're a whole person, everything in your life is going to affect your performance. It's a huge part of that. So for me, it took a long time to wrap my head around this, because it actually took a long time for me to even think about the fact that this might be affecting my training, because it's not something people talk about.
Yep.
Yeah.
And even as a woman who's been dealing with this forever, like, it's not, I always thought like, oh, whatever, I just train and that's it. But over time, I realized that actually, like, the day before my cycle would start, I just have terrible legs. And, with my coach, if we were doing a training block, I could just say like, hey, you've got me doing VO2 intervals on that day, that is not going to go well. And he'd, oh, of course, like, we'll move it back 2 or 3 days. And then I would get that workout and do high quality instead of trying to go smash it out on the day, feel like crap, have a poor performance that gets stuck in my head, that starts to erode my confidence and maybe affects the next 3 or 4 days of training.
So for athletes that don't have a coach, because that's probably the vast majority of people,
Yeah.
if they do have a VO2 max workout scheduled, how would you say 3 days is enough? Or how do you, first, we talked about this before, but maybe women on the pill, it's pretty regular and you know when your cycle is going to start.
Right.
But if you're not, how do you know? I have nothing about this. How do you, because I really want to build this into the product.
Yeah.
But how could we predict this, or is it surveys, or like, what do we do?
Surveys are really important. And I think that this is, everyone is different. So it's trial and error. So what it would take is just recording some data over, a few months. And the longer, the bigger the data set you have, the more you're going to be able to pick up on patterns like this. And even for a woman who's on the pill, who's having, very regular cycles and that she knows exactly how many days, surveying, like, even day in and day out, how's my mood? How's my energy level? Was I able to focus today? How did my legs feel? Do I feel recovered from yesterday's workout? Because it's going to affect your ability to recover well. And figuring out, how your cycle affects your own training is super, super important. But the problem is, like, I can't say, everyone's going to be the same that I was. Like, for me, it was the day before, and I had like a 24-hour period. And that's probably pretty lucky, because some women might have a few days. And for me, it was like, if we could just postpone 24 to 48 hours, I'd be good. But it took a long time to figure that out. So I think recording, just making notes, whether it's in an app or in just like a regular notebook. Go old school and analog.
So might someone would you do an aerobic ride that day, or would you take the day off?
It depended, but an aerobic ride would be fine. And the other thing that really helped was just knowing.
Yeah.
Knowing
that your performance is going to be lower.
Because otherwise it's
Question
very
your
easy
training.
for everybody, to question what's going on, what's causing this.
Oh my God, my taper's off or whatever. Like, I would just go into that ride knowing, like, I'm probably going to feel terrible. And you know what? It's fine, because 24 hours later, I'll be good.
So I like the idea with us, Chad, of just if you know that it's coming up, just skip that workout.
Just bump it, yeah.
Not even bump it, because then it could be really hard then to bump the rest of your training plan.
Yeah.
If you lose one Tuesday workout, Thursday's still going to be hard.
Yeah.
2 days from now, I would just skip it.
Yeah, it depends how much reshuffling you're willing to do.
Yeah.
How good a handle you feel you have on your.
And with your race day and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah,
Yeah.
sure.
At some point, at some point, we want to have Stacy Sims on the podcast.
Oh,
I'm sure
she's
she'll be able to
amazing.
speak a lot on it.
Yeah.
Chad, you were just at you got to see one of her
Yeah, I've
keynotes.
emailed back and forth with her. It's just a question of us aligning, when she's here and
Yeah,
making it,
yeah.
making it
Do
fit.
it.
I've got ideas to bring into the product. It's hard to, it's not easy, straightforward. Just be like, cycle starts, easy day,
Right.
Totally.
then go.
Yeah.
Because if
Yeah.
it was, that would be easy. But then there's some other things we want to do, and this fits in really well. And I don't know. So if anyone has other Dr. Stacey Sims, I really want to talk to her like off camera
Yeah.
and kind of figure out how to do do
Totally.
this well. But if anyone else does have great scientific ideas or
Anecdotes
anecdotes too,
Please share them with
yeah,
us.
either on the forum post
How
or
you end up adjusting your training around this would be great.
or Nate@TrainerRoad.com.
Yeah.
That'd be great too. I have one more other question.
Sure.
Woman-specific saddles and equipment.
Yes.
You had a great story about that, but I also want to know for if there's brands that you like. I know it's very saddles are specific to certain people,
Yeah.
but I think in general, you correct me if I'm wrong, but you might know for other pros that you've talked to, certain brands or types of saddles that work better for women versus. Because we talk so much about men's saddles and
Right,
Yeah.
totally.
I think the bottom line is just to know that you don't have to sit in sheer discomfort
believe it or
and
not,
misery.
even on the TT bike, because that's always been
TT bikes, if you can get to uncomfortable, you're probably doing really well.
Yeah.
It's like, yeah.
Talk about cognitive load, though. The people who have
Yes.
very comfortable saddles on TT, I envy them
yeah.
because they're
It's huge.
they're probably
dedicate
gaining 10 watts.
Yeah, your
Yeah.
body is just screaming at you because of the
Yeah.
discomfort otherwise.
Yeah, and then discomfort is a distraction that
Yeah.
adds the load for sure. The interesting thing about this that I've found is a lot of men actually like women-specific saddles too, and then they feel self-conscious about buying them and don't, even if it's a better saddle for them.
I could see that.
And
yeah,
I
could
think-
see that
I
for
think
sure.
the industry is kind of shifting away from that a little bit, which is good. And I think that a good starting place, if you're a woman out there and you're really uncomfortable, it can be really hard to go in your bike shop and talk to the dudes in there about the specific kind of chafing that you're experiencing. But I think a good place to start is with a saddle that has a cutout. That's generally speaking more comfortable for women. But again, it really depends on the individual. And I know some women who just like the Arione flat saddle. I can't sit on that.
I still
but
don't know how. That's a fence post. That's all that is. Still don't know how people sit
Best
on it.
saddle in the world.
Yeah,
So
Chad,
that's
yeah,
all right.
yeah,
It's so
crazy.
it's so
Yeah,
individual. But I think it's just so important to go try a bunch of different saddles, and more saddle companies are offering demo fleets where you can go in and you can try different shapes and see what works. And honestly, like, give it a nice long ride. I mean, because sometimes those pressure points aren't going to make themselves known until you've done a few, maybe 2-3 hour rides on them.
Yeah.
And
Or the saddle breaks in. I've had that before where I get a saddle
Yep.
and it's awesome. And like I test it, right? And then I get it, and after like 3 weeks, it starts to flex more and it starts to break in, and then it goes
Then it's
away.
great. Yeah. And honestly, like, don't be afraid to talk to other people about this, because this is literally everyone has this issue. And I know you guys have talked about this before. It's not something, to be, ashamed or,
Yeah.
Everyone.
Everyone has
Genuinely.
this problem.
Yep.
Yeah, so I was on a team when we were sponsored by a particular saddle company that, like, it did not work. Like, I could sit on the tops and kind of in the drops, but I could not TT on the saddle. And basically the compromise was that I just never rode my TT bike for an entire season because I wasn't allowed to use a different saddle on the TT bike. But I mean, I just physically, it was impossible. And especially given that most of our TTs would come mid-stage race, I mean, it was ridiculous to expect that I would do a TT one day, feel completely destroyed, and then get back on the saddle and try to do 150K stage the next day. It's just not realistic.
Yeah.
So that was a big bummer. And I think I actually had the opportunity to talk to the guy who invented the Adamo,
Yeah.
the ISM Adamo at Eurobike a few years ago, and we got in this huge conversation about, because I was like, thank you for not making this about sit bones, because it's never the sit bones that are the problem, especially for women. And he just laughed, and we were talking about it, and he was saying that, he'd been working with a lot of men and male pro cyclists, and he said there were a lot of young guys. I mean, they actually had blood in their urine, and I mean, that's a serious health concern.
Yeah.
And the teams would not let them change saddles.
Yeah. I feel like saddle manufacturers and shoe manufacturers have it pretty tough because they make a very individual product. But if you're sponsoring a team, it's like your worst nightmare if you're paying money for them to use something and then somebody doesn't use it. But that's why I really like teams that don't have saddle sponsors, don't have shoe sponsors, and they kind of like run what you brung on that side for specific things like that are so individual.
Yeah. And some companies are better
tricky.
than others about soliciting feedback and saying, you know, and working with you. Like, if they don't have a model of saddle that works for you, that's an amazing opportunity for that company to come up with a new model that's going to serve another group of people. So I think, you know, some companies are more willing to do that than others.
Yeah.
But.
So what's your, and this is individual, but what's your road saddle and what's your TT saddle?
I really like the ISM Adamo for both.
Yeah.
And now there's a few
I've seen more and
Adamos,
more
right? There's a Adamo Race and there's a Adamo. Do you know which one you have?
The PN3. So
Yeah.
PN3.
Yeah.
I've seen more and more people using Adamos on the road. Or similar type of saddles, too.
Yeah, it really got popular with triathletes originally.
Big time.
Like, as everything.
Yeah.
Triathletes do
They're
everything.
trendsetters.
Yep, and it looks like a
Roadies will
funny
never
saddle.
admit it. But
Yeah, it looks like a funny saddle, and people didn't. That's a triathlete saddle.
Soon enough, we won't have socks. All of us roadies.
Yeah.
They're just leading.
That goes in
Shakes
cycles.
his
That
head.
goes in cycles, let me tell you.
I'm totally joking.